Chapter 13. Seeds of Memory. Mists of Sacrum. Second part. The truth is never a single truth. Truth is buried in the deep roots of history, but history is not unique either. Every people, every culture has its own, their own version of events. That is why there are as many truths as there are people in history. Angus of Desadal.
Empire City to leeward,
bellowed the lookout from the crow's nest perched high on the mainmast of the ship. Responding to some sort of seafaring custom, the crew celebrated the news with spontaneous cheers and by raising their oars in a ritual salute. They were brief, but enthusiastic. It was as if they had made port after sailing for months in the treacherous expanse of the ocean, rather than making a routine journey on the calm waters of a river. Sorum could not understand what motivated the sailors to greet each new destination with such joyous enthusiasm. Sorum leaned against the sturdy wooden railing on the starboard side of the vessel and gazed out at the granite walls of the city battlements. Beyond them loomed the shapes of the city's most renowned buildings whose height and size dominated the skyline. The most recognizable of these were the innumerable towers of the imperial stronghold, the glorious and famed Bellador Castle, the former residence of the Emperor. He was returning to this city after nearly 20 years in the Aristan, after a war, after great devastation. Having now in his hands an object that had been previously regarded as nothing more than a fanciful myth. He was sailing up the same stretch of the Torin River, just as he had done 2 decades before. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Today he was here to begin his search for the Awakened One. But the previous time, he had returned from the bowels of Caravanser, the Dragon's Peak, with that despicable monk, Ra. The mission was different then, but one that had encouraged the cult to employ him again. At the stirring sight of the immortal city, where it had all begun, he could not help past memories from drifting into his mind. He recalled the image of Ra standing on the forward-most part of the prow, looking out onto the horizon.
"22 years before the present."
It was not difficult to guess what was keeping the servant of the moon so quiet and still. Lost in thought, he stood motionless with his gaze fixed on the crenellated walls of the Empire City. Even an unobservant mind would have noticed that his eyes were looking beyond the impregnable walls of the vast metropolis, trying to visualize the inner buildings that rose behind them. Perhaps he was looking at Bellador, the great imperial fortress, but it was far more likely that his aging eyes were fixed on the pontifical temple of Kala. That was where they were headed, the destination of their journey. The black tops of the sanctuary could be glimpsed behind the line of battlements, thrusting into the air like spears covered in fresh blood. This was the high temple, and within its interior there was a throne. Upon it sat a man who was the equivalent to the emperor himself among his own people. He was Lord Ossrik, High Pontiff of the Order of the Eye of Kala, with whom they had arranged an audience. It was perhaps he who had plunged the decrepit monk into contemplative silence. And with good reason. Ossrik was not exactly a pious soul.
"This is your first time, isn't it, Monsignor?"
Sorum commented to the old monk, moving to his side and glancing at the growing silhouette of the city they were approaching. Ra looked at him with a wry grimace and did not answer. His monk's robes fluttered in the cool breeze, ruffling his wispy white hair.
You need not answer me, Ra. There are things I can see even if your tongue does not reveal them. You have never been in his presence, have you? And you fear him. You fear him with abject terror. He is your chief, is he not?
He said, for lack of a better word. The monk gave him another hard, sour look, which brought a smile to the Veilweavers' face. It amused him no end to see the haggard old monk try to feign stoic indifference when he was clearly gripped by uncontrollable fear.
Your Lord Ossrik.
Sorom continued with a grin.
I find him affable and a man of his word, which is a rarity these days. He has a passion for antiquity and knows much about the artifacts of the past. At last, a cultured man with good taste, and not the bunch of fanatics I am normally forced to deal with.
Ra found it irritating that Sorom spoke so casually and disrespectfully of the Supreme Pontiff. The beast had no idea what he was saying, nor to whom he was saying it. However, Ra wanted to divert the conversation away from the confrontational tone it was taking. He had nothing to gain in arguing with the Veilweavers, who would try his best to provoke Ra at every turn. It would only embitter the old monk for the rest of his journey.
The chalice, Sorom. Is it safe?
He asked. The ostentatious lion man grinned sarcastically again, a wicked gleam in his feline pupils.
That is not my problem, Monseigneur. It is yours. I was hired to find it. It is you who must see to its safe arrival. My part, which was undoubtedly the most difficult, has been a resounding success. Your great lord would be very angry if anything happened to the sacrum. Wouldn't he, Monseigneur? He would impale you on a burning stake and leave your corpse for the crows, I suppose.
Shut up at once, you beast! Spare me your sarcasm. Nothing must happen to the sacrum, but if it does, I assure you that no one will be able to prove that we ever found it.
Please.
The Veilweavers replied, without feeling intimidated. He knew he had hurt the monk, where it stung most.
Where is the cargo?
Ra asked next, referring to the stolen relic.
In the hold of the ship with the rest of the plunder, of course.
In the hold!
He shouted so angrily that even the Veilweavers gestured to the monk to tone down his voice.
Surely you at least left a guard.
Oh, no. Should I have?
The lion man added, feigning concern.
I thought it would attract less attention if no one guarded it.
The monk flushed with anger.
You foolish, reckless pig, bloody, senseless brute. Your stupidity will cost us both dearly, you idiot. Pontiff Ossrik is not a forgiving man. No doubt he will have you beheaded and order your animal face hung from his throne if you give him the slightest chance.
He hurried off, gesticulating and cursing as he called to his men.
Oh no, he won't, Ra.
The lionid whispered to himself as he watched the priest's hasty departure.
I am needed, but you are worthless to them. Anyone can take your place, you decrepit old monk, but I am indispensable.
The vast white walls of the Empire City seemed to reach for the sky. The sailors were in awe as the war frigate passed through its stony bowels under the massive white stone arches that gave access to the city along the river. The flow of the Taurem cut the vast walled city in half. The entrances, allowing the river to flow through, formed huge arch-shaped tunnels in the battlements. In those moments, nothing disturbed the tomb-like silence, a solemn silence of profound respect. They were crossing the threshold of the Empire. The figurehead on the ship's prow reached the other side, and as if by miracle, the light of the twin suns illuminated their faces. Everything returned to normal. The ever-frenetic interior of the walls welcomed the sinister ship and its secret cargo. A moment later, they were in the harbors. They were the largest river ports in the entire known world. 100 or more ships and vessels of all sizes, shapes and functions went about their business in the congested port zone. There were Rurkan merchant ships, Syrianan corvettes, Kai Zues, and elven senatorial ships. Alongside them, Yulian, Galinian, and Tiban, Chabas, fishing boats, luxury barges, and flamers of many different origins and banners packed the limited space. It was a chaotic melting pot of languages, coats of arms, banners, goods, races, and colors. But in the end, this was the immortal capital. That was the defining character of the great empire city, a confluence of the most diverse blend of people and cultures in the known world, where mixing was not only inevitable, but indispensable, although many would deny it. Tall, menacing watchtowers stood guard over the docks alongside the ships of the Imperial Navy. Spearmen and halberdiers of the Stygian Cross were on guard to ensure the security and smooth flow of operations around the busy port area. The enormous wealth generated by the river ports had encouraged the growth of an entire urban district, patrolled by shining breastplates, swords and lances of the ever-vigilant imperial orders and city watch. Numerous inns and taverns plied their trade to weary and thirsty travelers. Blacksmiths, coopers, herbalists, healers and carpenters offered their services. There were interpreters, money changers, and small chapels. A little further away were gambling houses, brothels, fighting dens, and other establishments of dubious repute. There was no shortage of cart, horse, and mule hirers. A large market near the harbor allowed merchants to trade their goods immediately on arrival. There was great interest in all the exotic handicrafts from distant lands or cultures. Other smaller markets served the numerous fishing boats which used the port as their base. It was not uncommon to see thousands of posters and advertisements nailed to billboards with the strangest offers and requests, including the hiring of mercenaries or sailors. There was constant bustle and activity, as chaotic as it was controlled, and as wild as it was civilized. It overwhelmed anyone who saw it for the first time. A sinister black carriage displaying distinctive emblems and insignia awaited the committee and its precious cargo, ready to take them to the pontifical temple of the goddess Kala. The wheels shook and the axles creaked as it was pulled along the cobbled street by two fiery stallions.
Have you got it?
The occupant of the carriage asked from behind the curtain. In a theatrical gesture, Soram pretended to pull it out.
No, not here.
The occupant hastened to order.
Get inside first. There are too many eyes here.
The committee entered the carriage, obscuring themselves behind the dark curtain. The driver shook the reins, and the stallion set off with a snort. The people nearby turned away from the carriage in haste and superstitious fear. They made signs of protection with their hands or averted their eyes as it passed. Soon after, the awe-inspiring outline of the sanctuary unfolded before them in all its splendor. Its towering black crests stretched across the sky like a colossal palisade, as if reaching out to the gods in a display of arrogant defiance. These sinister forms, even in the blazing light of the twin suns, were terrifying to all who set eyes on it. They inspired the same superstitious and vulgar fear that so irritated the Felid, and a feeling of inexplicable dread. A terrible shudder ran through Soram's body. An unsettling fear gripped him, as if he were being watched by the goddess herself, in whose name such a monstrosity had been built. The coach driver halted the horses as they arrived at their destination. The committee stepped out of the wagon to find themselves standing at the front gate. With trepidation in his heart, Soram entered the domain of the goddess of night. The great double doors of the main hall opened slowly. A curtain was drawn back, allowing the visitors to admire a wide and high chamber open out before them. Lines of men dressed in plate armor formed a straight corridor through a throng of court officials, monks and temple servants, forcing their eyes to focus on a specific point in the distance. The throne, raised on a small podium with steps leading up to it. The throne chair had an elongated backrest, which towered like a banner into the air, reaching many times the height of a man. It was overflowing with ornaments and decorations. On it, sat Ossrik with an impassive expression on his face. He was dressed in all the finery and insignia that marked him as the chief figurehead of the order. He stood surrounded by courtiers, servants, and other members of his retinue. Behind him, dressed in blood-red robes, stood those who were considered the true power in the cult, the Veilweavers, the soulless lords, the lictors and cryptors of Cala. A reputation that was well-deserved, as the election of the pontiff was one of their powers. Their long capes and veiled mitres hid an unknown, perhaps inhuman identity. They inspired more fear than Ossrik himself. A heavy silence had fallen over all those who had gathered there, as if they all knew who the visitors were and eagerly awaited the news they would bring. Ra swallowed hard. Arriving at the base of the pedestal, the three figures bowed before the dark monarch.
Her will.
The third moon, Archduke Velga, announced solemnly, his gaze glued to the ground in submission.
The Reverend Ra and Sorom the Seeker have returned from the Sacrum Temple with important news.
Ossrik was tall and sturdy, yet he looked lost in the ornate robes, rings, and emblems that encompassed him. Every layer of his paraphernalia was covered in luxurious jewelry, expensive ornaments, and arcane runes. He was not necessarily old, though his face showed the wear and tear of the forbidden arts, the decay that eats away at body and mind. He looked powerful. The sunken temples hardened his eyes. The rictus of his face showed bitterness. He looked unpleasant and full of unbridled arrogance, expressing contempt for all else. Sorom prayed that Ossrik still needed him.
"Do they have it, the Chalice of Sacrum?"
a voice asked, in a whispery tone. Ossrik had not moved his lips. Neither had the footman whom Sorom had recognized as his chamberlain. The Feli did not know to whom such a venomous voice belonged. Without raising his head, Velger snapped his fingers. At his signal, a monk burst into the hall, carrying the chalice on a golden tray, cushioned by a purple cloak. He brought it solemnly to the pontiff. And so it came to pass. Ossrik made no comment as he held the glittering chalice in his hand. The relic glowed as if it generated its own light. It was beautiful, smooth in outline, but without much ornamentation. A fine, elegant piece. It was a little frightening to know that the myth had become reality before his eyes, that if he stretched out his fingers, they would brush against its millennia of existence. And time would melt away in an instant, causing any real sense of the present, the distant past, and the far future to be lost. The expression on his face, eyes betrayed the excitement of the moment, his eyes gleaming with mad pleasure. Then, like hungry vultures, the Veilweavers approached from behind. Their blood-red robes fluttered like a raging sea of crimson, unleashed in a chaotic swell of voluminous folds and vast veils. They swarmed round the chalice as if it were a carcass from which to tear the tastiest piece. They leered at it lasciviously from behind their veils like wild beasts drooling over fresh meat. One of them turned to the High Pontiff and whispered in his ear. At the same time, the others slowly regained their composure and formed a hieratic line around the throne. Ossrik motioned to his servant.
"It pleases her excellent will that you rise,"
the legate announced. Relieved to leave that awkward position, the three obeyed and were free to look directly at the pontiff. He whispered something again, which the servant hastily and obediently brought to the attention of the room.
"Her excellent will informs me that he is very satisfied with your success. He earnestly requests that you wait as guests in her will's palace until you can be duly rewarded. Are calavis neferai."
Are calavis, her will.
They replied with the utmost reverence. A small retinue advanced to escort them away from the main hall of the High Temple. One by one, they slowly approached the pontiff and kissed his feet before leaving. Sorom waited until the end. He was not at all happy to kiss the man's feet. So when it was his turn, he nodded respectfully, put on his feathered hat, and headed for the exit doors. He thought the worst was over. but he had barely taken a few steps when he heard the Chamberlain call out his name. Sorum turned without betraying his growing displeasure. This was not the best place to test his stubbornness, but he knew himself well. He would rather die than grovel to anyone. Then he looked nervously at the ornate throne. He tried not to think how his head would look hanging above it.
Your Highness.
Sorum replied, as cordially as his vocal cords could offer. All who heard him did not doubt his nerves of steel, nor his courage that had been tested in 1,000 battles.
Master Sorum, Her Magnificent Will wishes to know why you do not pay your respects to him in person. Protocol demands it, sire.
With all due respect, my lord, I am not of your order. Your rank does not concern me, nor does your protocol, in view of which I have nothing to offer at your feet.
The atmosphere became so charged with tension that it could be cut with a knife. The Chamberlain responded with anger, even though the pontiff had not demanded such a vehement reaction.
What kind of arrogant insolence is this? How dare you, in his presence, you blabbering beast, kneel before the will of the goddess?
Sire, I have not undertaken a journey fraught with hardship,
the Felid declared with obvious discomfort to the High Pontiff, ignoring the Chamberlain.
Nor have I risked my life, nor endured the insufferable company of your reverend, nor brought you the most precious of the Jariva's legends, to be insulted by a chattering parrot, by this middleman, who would not hesitate to sell his own mother in exchange for a thimble of venerated spittle from her overwhelming will. Know that I am a professional who was given an impossible mission and returned successfully. I didn't expect trumpets and celebrations, but by the gods! Nor did I expect such nonsense from your trained lackey. If I have come to this house to be insulted, at least have the decency to do it yourself, your eminence.
Even Ra, who had stopped halfway to the exit, admired the boldness of the Felid in these tense moments. It was also true that he fondly hoped this would be his last display of arrogance.
Kneel! Kneel! Or you will regret it!
Roared the Chamberlain, flushed with anger.
My apologies, my lord.
The Felid's voice was charged with sarcasm. After what he had just said, Sorum assumed that there was little he could do to make his situation any worse.
I would rather be skinned alive than kneel before a human.
Sorum reached for his disproportionately large sword, which never left its sheath. The Felid's intention did not go unnoticed. The temple guards, including the dreaded immortals, drew their weapons. The Felid's hand froze around the hilt of his sword. Sorum realized he was at a disadvantage. He was in the lair of the beast.
Master Sorum.
The voice was calm, full of tranquility, an eerie voice that forced the entire audience to pay attention to it, ignoring all other matters. It was the voice of Ossrik, the bearer of the Divine Lady's will.
Come forward. I will not beg you before my own court.
Sorum understood that no further disobedience would be tolerated. To continue such defiance would lead to his certain death. His pride was not worth that price. He obeyed.
You have courage. That is a rare virtue among those around me. But you're not very clever, no. Better to be skinned alive than submissive. If I were to order men to do as you suggest, you would be quick to curse your own words.
Lord Ossrik gestured for the crowd to leave the hall. They all did so. Monks, counselors, ministers, servants, and soldiers all filed out. Only the elite members of the Immortal Legion remained at their posts beside the throne, their faces obscured beneath their sinister masks. Behind the pontifical throne, the veiled figures of the Veilweavers did not move either. The vast hall remained in complete silence, like that of a tomb. Sorum felt uneasy and insecure in this place. Then he heard again the bitter, malevolent voice that had spoken to him before. It belonged to a lictor, one of the veiled faces of the Veilweavers. Unfathomable secrets were hidden behind their latticed mitres, and the voice sounded sarcastic.
You are truly the best suited for our plans, Master Sorom.
Sorom could just make out the faintest movement in the folds of the lictor's cloth.
You are the best in the field.
A second voice added, even more sinister than the first.
We have chosen you.
The best. After the Lord of Runes, of course.
A new voice clarified, echoing their distinctly mocking tone.
Of course.
The Felid whispered to himself with bitter resignation. Before him stood the very top echelon of the cult. Those soulless men with hidden faces and blood-red robes. Those voices full of malice were the ultimate puppet masters. Even Ossrik, who had been chosen by them, had to answer before the court of the Veilweavers.
You seem to be quite an expert.
A new cryptor addressed him, displaying his ashen wrinkled flesh as he spread his hands.
Some of us harbored our doubts,
But we have been convinced by evidence.
The second voice concluded. The owner stepped forward to take the sacred chalice with his long-nailed bony fingers and raise it to his veiled gaze.
by exquisite evidence, though
Another of the voices interjected.
our ambitions go far beyond collecting antiquities, Mr. Sorom.
It made the Felid nervous not to be able to see the faces of those addressing him. Their voices seemed to be different shades of the same color, as if they were several versions of the same person. They were all identical in height and build, dressed in blood purple and wearing sinister veiled mitres. They were like the multiplication of the same shadow. Without identity, no difference, no emotion.
If you are not the best,
Announced a new lictor.
you are at least the most expensive. Your fees are not what can be called usual.
Neither are your demands, your honors.
Ossrik smiled at the Felid's new display of insolence. Even in front of the Veilweavers, Sorom could not bury his pride.
Tell us, Sorom.
The Veilweavers' aura of power grew with the resonance of their withering voices.
What exactly is it that you bring us?
Your honors know very well.
He replied with the utmost politeness.
Come on, Sorom.
You wish to impress us? Show us your qualities, your knowledge. You crave glory.
This is the moment. Show that you are the ally we need.
Or disappear.
They knew how to penetrate his mind, his desires, his mood, as if their hidden eyes could empty his brain. In truth, Sorom really wanted to reveal everything he knew about this ancient and powerful artifact, for no other reason than to place himself above them. This malevolent cohort might have the accumulated power of generations, but they were nothing more than fanatics. He was the true scholar, the sage. It was his conviction that the cult had no idea of the true nature of the sacred chalice. That for them, it was nothing more than a glittering trinket. On the one hand, he wanted to laugh at the ignorance of these withered and pompous beings. On the other hand, he did not want to fall into a trap. The cult was as slippery as a snake.
It's a long story, your honors.
He explained flatly.
You have the time, Master. All
The time.
in the world.
There seemed to be no way out. Sorom hesitated for a moment. He was not sure how to begin the story he had been requested to tell. The delay also gave him some time to gather his thoughts. He intended to pick out the key facts, names, and dates. Then he would put them in a logical order before presenting them. It would be a mythological narrative. He would not bore them with exhaustive detail and explanations. He would tell these sinister figures a story, the one they wanted to hear. It might even be entertaining.
According to the Sacramentias, the chalice was forged by order of the god Jariva. Exactly how or when is unknown. There are no references to this fact anywhere else, or at least they have not yet been found.
The Felid's voice returned with a firm tone. It had regained its usual confidence, erasing any trace of uncertainty.
Nor is it known to which masters the work was entrusted, but it must have been long, long ago.
Sorum paused to check the expression on the only face in his audience that was unobscured, that of Pontiff Ossrik. He watched the Lionid in silence with a sickly grimace on his face. He did not say a word, nor miss a detail. If there had been a crowd of young apprentices present, they would not have paid as much attention to the story as these old withered figures.
As I imagine this venerable audience knows, according to the accepted cosmogonies, Jariva, who was the father of Artos, and who in turn was the father of Yelm, was the god of divine justice in the time of the first elven kings. In those days, the lines between legend and reality blurred together and were difficult to delineate historically.
Sorum began to feel at ease. His discourse had managed to melt the enormous block of ice that the suspicion, fear, and mistrust of his sinister listeners had created for him. All the talk of the past and its myths soon made him forget anything that might have overshadowed this or any other subject. Soon he ceased to speak directly to the shadowy pontiff or the solemn wall of robed men formed by the Veilweavers. He slowly paced back and forth as he recalled passages from the Sacramentias and related them to his audience. His movements became more fluid and expressive, so much so that on more than one occasion he seemed to be talking to himself.
In those dark days of history,
he continued,
many of the servants who had aided the Prince Chaos in the mythical divine wars, then long past, were still at large and hunted by the followers of the light. Maldaroth, the flayed prince, who according to legend was the first to be seduced and given the gift of Chaos, seems to have been the most important of the Chaos Prince's servants. At the very least, he was certainly the most dangerous or troublesome. It was he who probably caused the most problems for the rulers of those distant ages.
Sorum looked into space, as if oblivious to his sinister audience. Then he turned to his audience theatrically with a sparkle of excitement in his eyes.
It was then that Jariva, Lord of Justice, Avatar of Divine Punishment, decided to intervene in the conflict in order to destroy Maldaroth once and for all and wipe him from the face of the world.
Sorum knew perfectly well that this was not really the case, but that did not matter. It was what these ignorant zealots wanted to hear.
It is said that it was then that he had the blessed chalice forged. He called it the Sacrum, the Sacred One.
There was an imposing resonance to his words that added solemnity to his discourse. At the same time, he firmly raised his arm to the chalice, gleaming and majestic on the golden tray upon which it had been placed.
A sacred chalice, indestructible by human means, the very essence of purity. With it, he intended to nullify the corrupting power of Maldaroth and remove his presence forever.
The Phalid paused for a moment and stared defiantly into Ossrik's face. In the gloom of the chamber, Sorum had not noticed that the expression on the High Pontiff's face had tensed slightly, in apprehension that Sorum's insolence may go too far. But the eyes of the giant Phalid were not really looking at him. They were lost in space, lost in his own thoughts and ideas. Sorum relaxed. He adopted a much calmer posture. With exquisite delicacy, he pulled his hair back into a ponytail and wrapped his long cloak around him, ready to continue.
To ensure victory, Jariva sent for 12 paladins, 12 knights skilled in combat, all brave men with a high sense of honor. Many answered the call. They were important nobles, experienced adventurers, and powerful warriors, even kings. He chose 12.
The artifact seeker's posture stiffened, and he looked with confidence upon the spectral wall of Veilweavers.
Some were chosen from among the human warlords, which speaks for the importance of that race even in that distant time. The rest came from among the elven paladins, lords of the world at that time. If the stories are to be believed, with them he founded the Order of the Knights of Jariva, the judges and executioners of the divine law. He gave them the chalice of sacrum and charged them with the task of finding and destroying Maldaroth.
Again, there was silence. It was a profound silence, laced with a certain latent tension, the kind that comes from delaying the inevitable.
However, Maldaroth was not slain, nor even defeated.
Sorum's voice had faded to a faint whisper, barely audible now.
In fact, the Knights of Jariva, and even their mentor, underestimated the power of this primeval demon. Maldaroth captured every single Jariva hero, as well as the sacred chalice, which he perverted and corrupted with his rotting blood. He forced his captives to drink the same drained poison from his veins, and they lost their immortal souls forever, becoming black paladins of darkness. They have since been known as the 12 Atani, the scions of Maldaroth. Now, tainted with darkness, the chalice, like the ill-fated heroes, fell into the service of the corrupted one. The weapon of light now served the enemy, and then darkness enveloped the land.
From the high domes, out of sight and lost in the shadows above, the powerful echo of the Phalid's words could still be heard as they resounded from wall to wall through the ornate chambers of the sanctuary. Sorum paused here. His throat felt parched.
Tradition has it that Jariva himself donned his heavy armor and took up his legendary weapons, the spear and the hammer. He set out to hunt the demon and the creatures he had helped to create. But all he found was death at the hands of his enemies. The cult of Jariva ceased to exist. However, it was later found to have continued underground, forming a secret order that spread like wildfire across continents, races, and peoples. They recruited the best of the best. It took a long time for them to become a legion. Their ultimate purpose was to destroy Maldaroth and his Atani, and restore the sacred nature of the Chalice of Jariva. With so many eyes and ears working in the shadows, they eventually discovered the demon's lair and hunted him down. They found him alone, without the fierce defense of his dark paladins to protect him. Dorium Fitfergs, general of the new Jariva Knights, drove his spear through the demon's chest and tore out his heart. Legend has it that it fell to the ground and turned into a black stone.
Sorum took a deep breath. His heart was pounding, but he didn't know if it was from excitement or fear. After the pause, his words came out calm and collected.
The chalice could not be destroyed, for it was designed to be indestructible, nor could it be returned to its holy state. As with Jariva dead, no one else possessed the necessary skills to do so. And above all, Maldaroth was not dead. He had only been defeated and put into a deep sleep. Only the power of the chalice could destroy him. The new Knights of Jariva performed a ritual of imprisonment. They used the ill-fated chalice to make the dormant state of the demon irreversible. He could not be awakened without the relic. The black stone, taken from Maldaroth himself, was used as a seal. It was split in two halves, making it easier to secure and more difficult for the demon's hosts to find. This is how Maldaroth remains dormant to this day.
The Phalid felt a tingle down his spine. An unsettling realization came to him. He began to understand the insane intentions of the cult. By all the gods! They want to awaken Maldaroth, he said to himself. The pontiff's wide, staring eyes had taken on the aspect of a madman. They pierced Sorum as if they could see into his mind and read what he thought of them and their demonic fanaticism. The grave voice of one of the Veilweavers brought him out of his anguished reflections.
So, what happened, Sorum?
For the first time, the Phalid was truly afraid. He swallowed, took a deep breath, and replied.
They went after the 12 scions of Maldaroth, who had formed their own army of servants they called Lav Atani. They were like bad copies of themselves. For generations, the armed disciples of Jariva hunted down and exterminated these vile creations of evil. One by one, the Scions themselves met a fate similar to that of their master. The 12 were imprisoned in a secret chamber known as the Hall of 12 Mirrors. With the 12 captured and the last of the Lav Atani exterminated, the sacred circle of Jariva Knights turned to secure the custody of the sacred relics, the now cursed chalice, the seals that encased the 12, and the fragments of the black stone. They became the Paladins of Light, the Guardians of Orthodoxy, the protectors against all that would mean corruption. It is said that for centuries they were the backbone of the empire and its emperors, until the emperors decided to dispense with their services. The Order of the Paladins of Jariva returned to the shadows, to the secrecy from which they once sprang. Many claim that the order simply disappeared. Others, however, claim that perhaps they still exist as they once did, in hiding, protecting their secrets.
Sorom fell silent, leaving the echo of his last words to linger in the thick atmosphere.
That's all.
Sorom announced with solemnity after a short pause.
That is all.
A hollow voice repeated, a dark, stale echo that spoke with frightening certainty.
Until now, Mr. Sorom. Until now.
Until now. The Felid repeated again, a storm of emotions swirling in his mind. He was filled with apprehension. They were beginning to play with fire here. Lord Ossrik rose from his elaborate throne. His guards did not move. Sorom stood for a moment, looking at this human of respectable stature and strong physique, whom the Felid vastly surpassed in size.
Very good. I enjoyed the story very much. You are a fantastic storyteller. The children would love you.
Sorom smiled with feigned satisfaction and bowed. He was irritated by such remarks, which had no other purpose than to ridicule him. Ra also used to annoy him with sarcastic comments. But Ossrik was the one who paid his fees, so Sorom had no choice but to smile and put up with it. That was the price of being a mercenary.
We are not done yet, Master Sorom,
the High Pontiff added, as he descended the steps leading down from the throne.
Now our expert must advise us. Tell us what exactly can be done with the chalice, scholar.
The Felid looked at him with concern, doubt reflected in his eyes. He had not liked the tone in which Ossrik had uttered the word scholar, nor did he like the real intent of the question.
Oh, no, don't misunderstand us, Master,
a Cryptor said, guessing where the Felid's thoughts were going.
We know exactly what can be done with the Sacred One,
said another.
So try to be eloquent, Seeker, and don't leave out any details,
added a third.
Otherwise, it may make us distrustful of you, and could sour our fruitful relationship.
A new lictor added maliciously.
We must take care of certain detail. You understand, don't you?
The first one finished. Sorom silently cursed the vile cleric and his gallery of fanatics. The Felid rubbed his hands together and gave them another artificial smile before answering. In his heart, he knew the relic was useless, except as an ornament to be displayed. But to tell them that would leave him in an uncomfortable position. So he set about the task of pleasing his audience again.
Technically, it's a key.
Technically?
According to legend, it was forged as a ritual weapon, a device that could offer a means of purification and cleansing. But when it was tainted, it lost that power. It can still serve that purpose, but only in the right hands. Alas, my knowledge does not extend to such matters. After the fall of Maldaroth, the Order of Jariva is said to have magically transformed it into a seal, giving it the power to bind and release. Its direct power would therefore be that of a key. By using the required ritual, the necessary materials, and the appropriate amount of power, the sacred chalice can theoretically imprison or release any mortal or divine entity.
So, we can imprison or release anything we want, Even a god?
Sauron was at the limit of his patience. His own self-restraint and the voice of reason warned him that it was not a good idea to antagonize these fanatics. But from what he could deduce about the cult's intentions, things were about to get out of hand.
With all due respect, Eminences, awakening Moldaroth with the chalice, that is mere theory. To release such an entity, assuming he actually exists, is beyond any artifact, beyond any ability. In my experience, myths are myths most of the time, even when there are objects that seem to confirm their existence. This chalice—
Silence, you wretch!
Bellowed a lictor. The whole pack of veiled miters trembled as if they were part of a single body.
We will tolerate no more of your insolence. No one said we were going to wake the first. Yet.
No one.
No one.
We respond to interests that are closer.
Much closer. Yet, ignorant novice, you'd be surprised how much this cult knows and possesses.
How much power dwells in these myths?
As they spoke, the hieratic line the arcane had formed earlier splintered apart. They each moved forward in a crouched posture, their bony fingers outstretched towards the Phalid in a threatening manner. Sauron had to step back, retreating from the bloody tide of red robes descending upon him. All the while, the soulless lords continued their barrage of threats towards him.
You would be surprised what we know. What we have access to.
Did you think your services were the product of an isolated event? The fevered ravings of a madman.
Whether you want to admit it or not, an era is ending and a very different one is beginning.
Are you ready, Mr. Sauron? You would do well to know which side to be on when the time comes.
The Morkian altar.
Do you recognize that name?
The altar.
It is clear that the Jariva no longer protect their relics. You should be on the side of the victors when the time comes.
Choose your place wisely.
The altar is a myth, Excellencies.
The Lionid defended himself.
We found the altar.
The text is being translated, and you could be of great use to us there.
Yes, they're of great use. Are you interested in Sauron?
Whose side are you on?
Does the altar exist? Is it real? And then—
Everything took on a new light, a terrible light. They were willing to do this. A new era. It was not just an expression. It was true, terrifyingly true. If the altar of the Jariva was a reality, he had to be there. He had to see it, to see how far they were willing to go in this mad venture, and what the consequences would be. Maybe it would come to nothing. Maybe everything would be destroyed in the attempt. He didn't have much to lose. Sauron looked at the hellish pack of robed beings before him with determination.
How much will you pay me?
In his memories, Sauron remembered only too well how Ossrik's booming laughter finally washed over everything.